Creating Change Management Capability, Experience Success, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Mark Hordes. Today's webinar will last about an hour. Note that if you'd like to send in any questions you may have for us, you can do that with the chat window in the upper right-hand corner on most people's computer screen. You can type in there at any time during the session, and we will then either answer questions as they come in. We are planning on a live Q&A at the end with Mark. And if we don't get to all of the questions, we will do a follow-up by email. So go ahead and send your questions in using that chat window. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I am in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Our presenter today is Mark Hordes. Mark is the Vice President, Organizational Performance Improvement and Change Management Lead for the Americas with Moulton Group. He is the co-author of S-Business, Reinventing the Services Organization. Mark won the Houston Business Journal's 2014 award, Who's Who in Energy. He is an alumnus of the American Graduate School of International Management, Thunderbird. He holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Houston, as well as an MBA and MS in Organizational Behavior from Aurora University. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
You're welcome, Sarah, and thank you all for attending. I know everyone's schedule is very busy, and I hope the time you invest in the session today will be worth your time and effort. This is a very profound and very interesting topic, one of which most organizations will go through, some of which have difficulty. Many have not been successful due to a variety of reasons. So I don't want to focus the session today on what has not worked, but rather what will work as you embark on a journey of change management to support any other business case you might have operating in your company. We will go through many different steps, and I'll show you some very practical things you can do tomorrow to make this journey successful. Obviously, in an hour, you will not be able to learn everything there is to know about change management, but the goal is to hope to make you more than dangerous on the things that you need to do so that you don't forget some important steps. There are obviously some other things that require different scope, different complexities, and different paces depending on the journey of the business change that you're embarking upon. But we will highlight the most essential, and ideally you'll find these worthwhile. Today we're going to focus on 4 key elements, and I believe these are the building blocks of a successful program. The first is, how do you prepare to gain business readiness? How do you manage a change program? Then how do you organize and execute the change? So that would be one very large rock, if you will. The second, probably the most difficult one that companies experience, is how to measure change. And I guess I've heard 100 times when a CEO asks a change lead or a business project lead, what has been the result of my investment in your change efforts? The typical response has been, we really can't measure change, but I believe things are better. I believe qualitatively people are happier. I believe qualitatively people are more bought in. And the CEO's response typically will be, can you show me quantitatively that that's true and worth the return on investment that I've made? So knowing that that's a challenge, I'm going to show you a measurement model which has worked very successfully in the client companies that I've worked with. It's not the only approach, but it's one that I have found answers the CEO's question, how can we effectively measure change? The third area of focus today will be about how to manage resistance. And unlike maybe many professionals, I don't see resistance as a negative factor. In fact, I see it as a positive factor because it's simply an additional data point, one of which you can learn something about, one in which you can move resistors to supporters to help them understand what the effect is of the change process and how to move forward collectively with you. And then lastly, an area that's often left out is fundamentally, how do we sustain the change? how do we reinforce the change? Many organizations assume that once training is complete, if it might be a simple technology implementation or an acquisition or a new leadership approach, that all they have to do is to train people up and communicate more. And they always forget about the sustainability piece. So I will touch on the most prevalent way to sustain change so that it embarks upon and utilizes change ideas to sustain an element of change that will ideally last the test of time. All right. In my background, I used to be a social psychologist. I coupled that with business and international work when I went to a school called Thunderbird. And I was always intrigued by Rorschach tests that psychologists could tell a lot about a journey to the mind, so to speak, and tell a lot about your personalities by simply asking to look at certain pictures and to see which ones your preferences are. So if you don't mind participating with me on the first step and a background about change management, I'm going to ask you to take a journey into your own mind, and you won't have to answer specifically because I can't see your hands go up, but I'll give you some trends here. And the first exercise, if you're looking at the screen, you'll see 4 images. An A, which is a square, a B, which is a circle, a C, which is a triangle, and a D, which is a squiggle diagram. So look at those 4 images for just a second and pick the shape or the image that you most identify with. Let's not try to make this into a mental exercise or a rational exercise. This is strictly an emotional experience. So pick the one that you most identify with. It may not be rational, it may not be logical, but it's the one that you like the most. So why am I asking this? Why is this an important element as we think about change and change management in the journey to make this effort successful? The main reason I'm asking this is because the perception that you have around each one of these images, preferably the one that stands out the most in your mind, will have a profound effect on how you go through change, how you lead change, and the impact that it has on people who will be with you in the change journey. And I really love this little cartoon by Wayne Dyer, and the heading says, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. I have found that extremely true in my own personal life and professionally as well. So if you look at the little cartoon, the guy on the island sees an image out there and he yells boat. The person in the boat sees it and he says land. So each one has a different filter. So the intent here is that whichever image that you chose, if you only have a fixed point of view about that particular image, it may not be the best approach to the circumstance that you're having to deal with and the impact it will have on the people who are in the journey with you. So let me go through each one of these and I think they'll become quite clear. Normally, and I would say I've done this session many times, there's about an equal distribution amongst each of these, the square, the circle, the triangle, and the squiggle, depending on the audience, but it's usually about a 25% each, more or less, depending on the companies that I'm dealing with in this type of workshop or presentation. But, you know, this audience may be a little different, but let's say, assumingly, you pick the square. Now, what does that tell you about yourself? And again, I wouldn't run to the psychiatrist if you don't like my answer here. This is based on a lot of experience of working with multitudes of companies and how I've seen it play out. People who typically pick the square often like a lot of order, logic, procedures, data, details, neatness, and particularly they like to see all 4 sides. This is often referred to the window view. And often you will see this as the forebearer of what we know as the 360 multi-tier feedback level. In practical terms, we might see someone say, before I'm going to make a decision, I want to hear from the field people. I want to hear from the support staff. I want to hear from our former employees. I want to hear from our customers. That's typically a window perspective. And none of these particular images are right or wrong. But if we simply take the orientation of this particular approach, it may not fit every single circumstance that we have. It will logically be like trying to fit a circle into a square. So let's just stay open and flexible to each particular image. The next one, if you selected the circle, which a lot of people often do, this one lends itself for usually a high concern for others, some kind of community action teams, a lot of harmony, inclusion, collaboration, formal and informal networks, and a lot of leverage around communications. Well, that all seems quite logical in a change journey and makes a lot of sense. However, it can be rather time-consuming if we constantly have to go for consensus and involve everyone all the time before decisions are made. So like the square, like the window, if we place all our bets on just the circle filter, it may lead to a degree of frustration because it may not be the type of approach that makes the most sense for the circumstance that you're confronted with. Perhaps you picked the triangle. Well, this is neither negative nor positive as well. A triangle often refers to, and you've probably seen this image, somewhat of a strong control and command orientation, usually top-down, problem-solving, fast decision, metrics, action path forward, a lot of tracking in progress. Well, that becomes quite important when we have to make fast decisions and we don't have a lot of time to socialize and to get a lot of people to buy in. However, you do find you get less involvement, less support, but in certain circumstances, a triangle orientation makes a lot of sense. And the last one, if I asked my team here which one they picked, they all raised their hand on Squiggle, which is the reason they're all on medication. I will say that a squiggle is neither negative nor positive as well, but it does lend itself to an orientation that is focused on creativity, adaptive, flexible, many cultures, agile, innovative. And there will be times in change programs where innovation becomes absolutely critical. So you have an opportunity to think about multiple ways that we can handle our own filters and see filters in others to be open to all four of these approaches, because all four of these will come into play as you move along the change journey. You will not just be fixed on a triangle perspective, a window perspective, a circle inclusion perspective. It is best to be open to all four orientations, less the frustration, more the opportunity. But knowing your own particular bias, if you will, your own particular filter, will help you be more objective, more neutral as you decide which one is most effective for the circumstance that you're confronted with. And ideally, you can bring others along with you. Well, let's get to the kind of meat of the story, if you will. First is a definition of change management. There are many, many definitions of change management. If you go on Google, the internet, you probably find hundreds. But I think they all pretty much boil down to the same thing. It's really the process of aligning the organization's people and culture with changes in the business strategy, organization, and process or systems, and changes transitioning from the current state of the organization to the future state. And the future state will be the business case for change. And there lies the challenge. All the emotions, all the behaviors, all the systems, all the processes that you'll have to get people to buy into to move from the current to the future state. So alignment is the critical driver here. Well, okay. What would a psychologist say about how people perceive change on an emotional or personal level? The first thing that they would say as they study human behavior is that most individuals, or humans, if you will, prefer some sense of control. Nobody likes to live totally out of control. There's got to be able to have some sense of control over our environment. They would also say that we have to have some predictability of the future. That it just could not be just random. So we like to have a sense about what will change and not change, so that we can have some predictability of how we can prepare ourselves for the future. They will also say that most people have an absorption level. I think you've seen this yourself. When confronted with a multitude of crises, you might yell out, hey, I can't take it anymore, like we saw in that movie or TV news show. So most people have an absorption level, and that is the level of emotionality, the level of control, the level of sense of being able to resolve the things directly in front of them. So absorption plays a very critical role as well. And then psychologists would also say that people have often very high levels of resolve, their ability to step up to challenges when confronted with circumstances, but often we have to tap into that. We have to nurture that. We have to help that grow. We have to build the confidence for resolve and give people the tools to understand how to do that. Well, all that's said and good, and I have a particular point of view about something which you may or may not agree with, and that what I have seen in organizations, there's something called the rule of three. And what the rule of three says is that it is very difficult, not totally impossible, but difficult to manage more than three very, very large change engagements at one time. Three large change business transformations at one time. Beyond three, I would hope you have a lot of change support and understand the pace, the complexity, and how you're going to sequence things, because roughly I've seen people cannot successfully manage more than three big initiatives at one time. They hit the ceiling on absorption level. Okay, so that's interesting, Mark. So what do these little boxes on the left mean? Well, the boxes on the left reflect we want to always hurry up and get through things. But, you know, when you think about it, there's a sequence to how people adopt to certain things. In the first checkbox, if you will, we want to be assured that people are aware of what we're doing. So as they encourage or encounter the change and they realize it's coming, that we have a high level of awareness about the content and the context of what it is. So that's your first gateway, making sure that over 90% of the people affected by the change have strong awareness of it. The second step, if you will, or gateway, is understanding. Now that I'm aware, gee, how does this change impact me? In what kind of way? My job, my hours, my scope of work, who I work with. So the second checkbox is understanding. And only when we get through understanding can we move people to the adoption level where we're pilot testing, trying some things out, putting our toes in the water, are willing to perform as the change requires. And if you can get through the adoption checkpoint, then you can get to the commitment level where I'm with you 100%. I don't know why we haven't done this before. I had a circumstance once in which I was working with a client, and they assured me everybody was 100% committed. And I took the commuter bus in every morning to the project which is out by the Houston airport, and I said, let me ride the commuter bus for a week, and let me ask people about the name of the project, which I can't obviously name, and see what their level of awareness and understanding was. Now, this project had been going on for 8 months. And as it turned out, as I asked people, what do you know about this particular named project? Let's call it Starburst for a second. That's not the true name. I found that over 80% had no awareness of it, no understanding of it, and therefore was not willing to adopt or commit to it. So don't be fooled when people say everyone's committed. Make sure you have checked the box on awareness and understanding before you ever get to adoption. These are tried and true gateways, which I have found to be 100% true. So let's allow you to take a quick self-assessment here. And like a polygraph test, this is real easy. This is just true or false, right? So think about your own company or the company you're most comfortable with. It might be a former employee, or let's say the one you're currently working. There's only 6 questions here. And probably I would have put number 6 first because that's really a driver. But let's start with number 1. And think about your own company, about how they manage change. And the first question is, my company effectively manages change. Do you believe that's true or false? The second question on the self-assessment is that managers, and I would say leaders, serve as effective change role models. They don't say one thing and do another. They're out there in the front of the fray, being optimistic, being positive, teaching people what needs to be done, and showing incredible sponsorship and advocacy for the change. True or false? Third point, change communications are clear and consistent, and that cuts across the whole organization regardless of the type of communications that you use. So have you found that to be true or false? Change impacts are identified. Gee, what's it going to do to me, my coworkers, my processes, my teams, how we go about dealing with customers, etc. Those are called change impacts. So have we identified those impacts, true or false? Have we successfully measured the change? When someone says, how do we know anything's been different, do we get a lot of qualitative answers, or can someone show us a quantitative response to show where we started as a baseline to where we ended up, true or false? And the last one, which I probably should have put as number one, is that we have a clear business case for change, a compelling business case for change. Change never happens for change's sake. It only happens to support some other initiative to ensure adoption of the processes by those who will be affected. So the obvious answer is, I hope you've answered true in every one of these, and then certainly if that's the case, you're a step ahead of the 60% of people who have failed in change efforts versus the 40% who've had more success. So these are just early earmarks, if you will, of what you need to have in place. And I would say number 6 is the first one that's important. Anything that's not listed as true in your own self-assessment clearly needs to be examined in terms of what I would call business readiness. So that was a little bit strategic. Let's get somewhat tactical. And if you didn't have a roadmap, if you're taking a drive or a vacation somewhere and didn't have a blueprint to follow, you'd probably get lost somewhere along the way, even if you had a GPS. So it's helpful to have a roadmap. And I've laid out for you here an 8-step roadmap. And often the question is asked, can't we just do a couple of these? Well, the answer is no. You got to do all of them. And there's probably some more things you could do as well. But I'm going to walk you through a roadmap to give you a tip of the iceberg for each one of these so that you can find your way along the signposts to get to where you're hoping to end up on a never-ending journey, so to speak. So the first one is business case for change. And if I had you in the room, I'd ask this hypothetical question relative to changes all around us. Change is occurring all the time. But what kinds of changes are occurring in your company today? And I'm fortunate to have a couple of my colleagues from Moulton Group in the room with me. And they work with a lot of different companies, big companies, mid-sized companies, et cetera. And Daniel and Elliot are here. So I'll ask Daniel first. Daniel, with the companies that you've worked with, what kinds of changes do you typically see are occurring in companies today?
Well, I work with a lot of oil and gas type companies, and a lot of their change is driven by a desire to have processes and procedures, particularly to manage safety and a growing concern about the environment, and how they can demonstrate that those processes and procedures are being effective.
Okay, thank you. And as you can tell, Daniel is from Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn, UK. Thank you, Daniel. And Elliot, what have you seen?
So I also work with a lot of energy companies, and a big topic right now is the talent gap that's emerging with a new generation entering the workforce and older generations retiring. So this leads to emerging cross-generational issues, especially the millennial generation having different communication strategies, different career expectations, which requires a lot of changes in performance management systems and reward systems, team orientations, and involvement.
Okay, thank you. And Julia, Julie Camp is one of my other guys. I don't know if she's available or not, but she mentioned to me that some of the things that she's seeing as well had to do with new leadership teams coming in, particularly as they have acquired new companies, and there's a whole different culture that people have to adopt to. And that makes those who were there being the acquirer and the acquiree somewhat challenged. So if we look at our own organization, and I'm sure you had your own list, this field of around 8 big topics are what I typically have seen in terms of what I call the business case for change. And again, you might check the box on how many of these are currently going on in your company today. If you checked off all these, I would say you probably need a lot of change management help. So maybe you haven't selected more than a couple here, but in companies today, the reason why they are doing change management has to do with one or more of these compelling business case for change alternatives. Strategy might be M&A work, organization might be plant startups or commissionings, big chemical plants, big energy plants from the ground up in the desert to reconstituting those plants. We're seeing quite a bit of headcount reduction, cost leadership, cutting a lot of money out of budgets, and now people have to adopt to faster cycle time. Shifts in culture, particularly with new leadership. Safety is a whole big cultural orientation in getting customers aligned, customer intimacy. A lot going on in technology. SAP, ERP, Maximo, ITSM, you name it. A lot of new technology for people to manage and learn different ways of operating information, both data management and big data. A lot of process examination going on, everything from asset utilization to maintenance to prevention. A lot of process changes occurring. New products and services, energy monitoring, training, new orientations, and new performance management systems. Everything from multi-tier 360 feedback to shifts in talent management, rewards, and recognition. So one or more of these has to be the business case for change. And every one of these will require some kind of change management orientation to make it effective. And again, if you checked off more than 4 plus these, I would say your need for change management is pretty severe. So what's the problem? Okay, employees, we've got this business case for change. So what are we asking of them? So what's the big deal here? So we're asking you to do all these things. Well, first of all, we're asking you to respond fast to different and perhaps multiple initiatives. Number 2, everything is being told is your priority. No prioritization, but everything's a priority. Number 3, please understand the new direction. 4, at the same time, learn new processes, learn new ways of communicating, accept a different job or new role profiles. And oh, by the way, there's a whole bunch of new tools you've now got to learn. And by the way, keep the business operating and don't disrupt the flow of revenue and profits. And most of all, accelerate the performance of the company while we're doing all the changes that we're asking you to do. So what does all that mean? It basically means you need an effective change management program to prepare your organization, because that's a fairly healthy list. And that has an impact on people both emotionally, content, and context-wise, so that they can continue to be productive and there will not be a dip or a disruption to the way that work is being done. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the thing to the right, not a problem, just the reality. The answer is the thing on the bottom. So let's look at change readiness. Now, if you were in the room, I'd ask you to raise your hand and answer this question. How many of you have children? Well, a lot of hands go up. And the next question would be, how many of you were totally prepared after your child was born to know everything you needed to know about how to raise that particular boy or girl? Well, hands would go down. I know in my own case, when my son was born, I never read anywhere what to do about his colic at 2 o'clock in the morning until I had to figure out to drive around my neighborhood and the sound of the car would put him to sleep. Well, let's just say I was less ready than more ready. When we think about change programs, we've learned through many, many initiatives that there are certain things that you should have in place before you are ready to embark on the journey. And the goal is to be more ready than not, sort of break the 50% barrier. And at least we want to have the predictability of success a little bit higher than the predictability of failure. So I've done a lot of research in this area. And what you see in the graph are the prevalent areas that we are required to have some sense of readiness, at least at the 50% plus level before you move forward. And the top 5 or 6 are probably most significant. The first being appropriate resources and funding. And what research, as well as Gardner and some other pretty big research houses, will say that whatever the journey happens to be, at least 15% of your budget needs to be dedicated to change management work, as well as the resource supply. Number 2, strong sponsorship. Visible, highly active, proactive, positive, strong sponsorship. Many people will talk a good show, so to speak, but never show up. Number 3, realistic expectations. We all love the buffet, but after the first 2 courses, we get kind of overfull. So what is realistic we can accomplish relative to action number 1? We want the world, but we're only willing to fund it at a 1.5% level. The case for change ought to be pretty compelling. If we don't do this, what's the downside? Project management skills, team skills are pretty important relative to some training that needs to occur so that people can learn how to collaborate together and how to manage many initiatives that will be under that umbrella. Having a sense of clear scope, as well as change history of successes, or I should say what has worked and not worked in the past efforts before. We don't want to replicate the failures that have not worked. We do want to continue to accelerate the actions, activities, and the protocols that have worked. And next 2, probably the one that's most difficult, how does our current initiative integrate in with other initiatives that are going on? And the last one, having adequate training capabilities. So it's a little bit of a checklist for you, and there's some obvious assessment instruments that can give you some profile relative to where we are, where we need to close some gaps. We don't have to be 100% perfect or 100% ready, but we need to be at least more ready than not in some of these areas, which may cause some delay until we can close some of the readiness issues. Because as we know, when things are often left alone, they will widen and get worse. So as the last tombstone tagline says, change projects are more likely to fail when the readiness for change is not addressed early in the process. Step 3. I have seen massive numbers of stakeholder analysis, and every change orientation approach has that in there, so this is nothing new. I would take a different posture and basically say it doesn't have to be as elaborate as most change processes say they need to be. I think you only have to think about 4 things and put several people in each of these boxes to understand better who has the power and the interest to impact our change efforts. First of all, the first one on the left top-hand side, there are certain individuals that we just need to keep satisfied. We may not fully understand what their ultimate orientation is, but we better understand what their needs, wants, and expectations are. We better understand what they need to know to be satisfied. And obviously, we would list their names and titles there. There are some people that we need to manage quite closely. I would say they are your wild cards in the bunch. These are people that often come with hidden agendas to disrupt, dismantle, blow up your change process and say, see, I told you so. And we better learn quickly who those people are we have to manage quite closely. I had a project once on a customer intimacy project which was very successful in the US. We went to roll it out in Europe and we got blocked 100%. The key resistor, as we found out, blocked it because it was not because it wasn't successful. It was because he didn't think people thought it was his idea, which it wasn't. So what we did an article, front page in the company magazine. We interviewed him, and everybody thought the project was his idea. He lowered his guard, became more neutral, and then we learned how to manage him more closely. He was definitely a wild card in the bunch. There's some people we just need to keep informed, either because they're in the decision cycle themselves, and we need to understand how they like to be kept informed. A simple email, a voicemail, a personal visit, a drop-in, a heads up, anything. But we need to understand what their particular communication needs are relative to the level of information that they need. And the last one, we need to monitor certain people, not because they're a danger, but because their travels might embark on them going to certain sites where we could have them talk about the change journey. They might be visiting certain plants. They might be teaching something or sharing with an executive team, of which we can get on the agenda. So keeping up with people's schedule is a monitoring activity. So the change stakeholder process does not have to be some massive thing. I think if you put a relative number of people in each of these boxes, then you're in better shape than coming up with a list of hundreds and hundreds of people, which you have more difficulty to fundamentally manage unless you've got a pretty large change staff. The next category I want to mention is managing communications, and this is a pretty critical one. And I don't know how a change process basically succeeds without it. The unfortunate thing is that most people feel that all you need to do is to send out an email occasionally or do an all-hands meeting, and that's all the change in terms of communications that's required. So what I put on this slide are all of the things I would ask you to consider in the utilization of multiple approaches to your change. And I think all of these play a critical role in how you put your change strategy together. First and foremost would clearly be doing a communication assessment to understand how people like to be communicated. What you don't see on this list is something which was very effective that I did once. We set up a rumor hotline, a number they could dial to post what they thought the rumors were about the project that were answered the next day by an executive to either dispel or confirm or change what the orientation was. I worked in a plant once where the literacy level was very low, but everybody sent out emails to the employees. Of course, they couldn't use a computer, had a hard time reading, so I convinced them that simply using posters and pictures was a better way. I also worked with a project once where everybody got their information from Betty in a local cafe, and they never read anything else or heard anything else. Nobody questioned how Betty got her information. But all of these things, all of these approaches, all of these orientations play a significant role in a successful communication effort in your company, knowing when to utilize them, who the senders are, who the receivers are, what's the impact you anticipate, and the timing for each and the vehicle used all come into play. But like I said, you tell them once, tell them twice, tell them 10 times, and they may understand it the first time, they may not. By utilizing all of these approaches, you get more than a shooter's chance to make sure the message gets out there multiple ways for people to understand. As I mentioned early in the presentation, the measurement process is the most challenging for people. So let me walk you through a change approach here that deals with measurement, because I don't believe you can really justify any investment in change management without a measurement orientation. And so I will share with you first a field of play. Think of this like a football field. If you look at number 5 is a baseline. And across the top, I've got 5 or 6 different critical areas. You might have 3 or 4 or no more than what I've got up here. But these are critical things such as communications, team environment, technology support, engagement, etc. And number 5 is your baseline. And there's only a couple ways to really get a baseline. The first is historical data. Now, if we don't have that, the second best is go out and collect new data. The third is to go ask some organizations benchmark information for each of these categories based on industry norms. And the last, least effective, but nonetheless a starting point, is really best guess. So we've got to put a numerical range or baseline for number 5. And then what we're going to do is make a progression forward and backward from 5 to 10, what we think the best case, and 5 to 1 to what we think the worst case, either appreciation or digression in terms of how that particular element is succeeding or not. Then you'll see the weight, and if we had 5 hypothetically, we would give them a weight of 20 each if that's the case. So that's a starter. 5 is the baseline, 10 is the ideal range of success, a digression down to 1 is worst case scenario, and then we're going to put in our weights. So what does it look like real time? Here's a real time picture. Let's take that current scenario. So you see number 5 is the baseline. 3-1, 3-3, 3-1, etc. So we go out and we collect some information. We do a survey. And in category 1, we went up 2 quadrants. That's why you see a score of 8. It was weighted 10. In category 2, dealing with leadership and sponsorship, we fell down to 2.5. The next one we stayed about the same. The next one we went up 1 quadrant. The next one we went down 1, up 2, stayed the same. So that becomes our current situation. And what we will see, number 10 over here, is our best case scenario. So now we multiply the score, like you'll see business case for change. A 4 fell into category 8 times the weight, that gives us an 80. Next one fell into field number 3, a weight of 20, that's 60. Next one stayed the same at 5 times 20, 100. Next one 7 times the weight, 70. 4 times the weight, 40. 8 score times 10, 80. And score stayed the same, 5, 100. Now, if we ratchet out like Las Vegas and hit 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 across the chart, let's assume for a moment that the ultimate score we could get on great success, rapid transformation, is 1,000. So where are we in this given point in time? We are at 730. And we can tell the story by just giving one number. Someone asked me, Mark, so how's the change process going? I said, well, out of a maximum score of 1,000, we've hit 750. And this is what we need to go forward. Or we've only hit 250. This is what we need to do better. And so many companies will organize either tiger teams or continuous improvement teams to understand why it's gone forward, what's gone backwards, and what we need to do differently. Now, this does require some level of survey work, and I would strongly suggest on a sample basis we do that at least every 3 or 4 months so we can keep a chart like this actively operating. And I've seen projects that blew these up and rewarded teams and efforts to continue to move them forward. So that's how we have to think about measurement from a scorecard perspective. In terms of leadership and sponsorship, as I mentioned, this is a critical success factor. The first thing is they have to set realistic expectations. You can't promise the moon and only deliver a spoon to eat tomorrow. The second is that delivering quick wins or low-hanging fruit develops a lot of positive energy. There's bound to be something that we can go after and change radically in the beginning that will show people that it's possible. Number 3, the element of recognition that supports a sense of urgency, action, and results is also critical on leaders' point. And also institutionalizing a new approach in the culture, as well as tracking issues and resolutions, lets the organization know that the whole process is pretty serious. So leadership and sponsorship is essential. And an active role in front of the groups, in front of the effort, lets you know that it's being highly advocated and supported. Now, many of you I know are trainers, and the old adage, if you think training expensive, try ignorance. So you know that training is going to require a pretty hefty investment. Well, really what the people who are experiencing the change want to know is how can you connect me to the journey? What's in it for me? What's in it for the company? How can you connect me emotionally to why I want to do this? The second thing they want to know is what new skills and competencies will I need to understand? How I can be a change advocate or a change agent, or how do I manage on a personal or professional level what is being confronted or what I'm having to go through, so the knowledge part of it. And lastly, I have found, and I'm sure most of you would agree, that having an experiential learning experience so that I can be better at communications, alignment, team building, participation, and decision making are an essential part of how people absorb information and how they utilize new skills. The last piece has to do with reinforcement. As I mentioned, you know, we can say, hey, training, we're done, but I think this picture really captures the reality of what has to be thought about as we think about these 9 types of efforts going forward, that we constantly have to be moving around all of these to keep the whole thing alive. The first, keep explaining why we are changing. Where possible, involve our teams in decision making. There's an old adage, those who tend to support those who tend to create will tend to support. If I'm making an emotional investment in the change and involvement, I will tend to support what we do collectively. Minimize uncertainty. Let people know what will change and not change. And I would say probably understanding what will not change is probably even more important. Engage your legacy systems experts early on, the whole technology aspect of it. Be as transparent as possible. Create learning opportunities for your team through training, through engagement in informal networks. Communicate, I shouldn't say the threat of not changing, but the reality of not changing. Keep listening to your people's concern. Probably one of the most important points is your change agents, your listening posts, getting feedback and taking it to heart about what's working and not working. And then celebrate the shifts toward the desired state. Let's never underestimate the power of rewards and recognition, particularly recognition for a job well done. So how will we know that this whole effort has passed the test of time and that's actually working? One, we'll see that the leadership sponsorship is visible and leaders are committed and upfront. Two, the staff understand why the change is necessary, what's expected of them, and what will impact them, what will change and not change. Staff and employees are well trained in their work. They understand the new tools and skills they have to utilize to be successful. Coaching as a reinforcer is active and across the organization and is perceived as the norm. Staff engagement, communication, and consultation is managed, timely, and effective, and that benefits are clear, that the clear change process has been delivered successfully, and that we can clearly understand and ensure that business continuity, minimizing disruption with targeted reinforcement are active every day to everybody's advantage. So that's, oops, forgot one. Gee, there's something that creeps up here called resistance, and I'm sure no one has ever seen that. Nobody ever resists, right? Wrong. But I think resistance is a pretty interesting phenomenon. So why will people typically resist? One, they don't think it's necessary or it's unnecessary. So they've probably never gone through the awareness and understanding cycle to see why it would be necessary. The second is they fear the change. They're not sure they have the fortitude, the skills, the understanding, the ability to deal with the change because they don't know how to predict the future or to manage it with and through other people. They feel they have no input. Everything's a surprise. And the interesting thing about surprises, the only time we really like that is when it's a party. We don't really like surprises. We don't like to not understand what's going on and be called short. The last is the next one, that we're not confident. We don't have the resolve, that we have the support, the tools, the understanding, the training, the active things we need to do to be more confident, to increase our resolve. The next is that we don't feel the company is supportive of the resources. There's not a change person assigned to each work stream. There's only one person doing the work of 50 on change. And lastly, I feel no sense of control over what is occurring here. It's all being done to me, not with me. And lastly, when I've done exit interviews for people who couldn't stand it anymore and quit, I try to get the heart of really why they resisted. And they often said three things. The first thing they said is, I don't get it. I know you guys try to communicate, maybe I'm just thick-headed or just an old guy, and I've been here 50 years, and I just don't get it. So we failed in terms of communicating, engaging that person, hearing from that person, and taking them in the journey. The second thing is that I don't like it. Well, not everybody's greatly enthusiastic about change, but if it's laid out in a systematic, managed, and easy process to absorb, we can get people through that threshold even if they aren't crazy about it. And the last one's a little more difficult to manage, where they say, I don't like you. Well, that's an important one. We could always send somebody like me to a change charm school. Better yet, to have a change leader who is highly respected, who might come from the field, who may not be a senior level person, but has the respect, the confidence, and the transparency that people are willing to support no matter what. So it may not be the rank in the organization as opposed to the personality of the individual. So these are the reasons people resist change, and these are data points. Interesting ones, certainly, to consider in your journey. So lastly, what will it take to gain support? Some sense of personal gain and benefit, both what's in it for me and what's in it for the company. Getting people to believe it's the right thing to do now. Let's think about the downside if we don't act. Involvement with the change. How can you share my ideas, my sense of what's working and not working, and ideas for the future? Respect for the person leading the change I just mentioned is really critical. Believe it's the right time for the change. Things are at a good turning point. It's a good time for us to do this for a variety of reasons. And I think most importantly, what will not change. Everybody wants to know what will change, but let's not forget the sense of stability and predictability, which is really all about what will not change. My desk, my office, my location, my job will not change. My tools will change, my software will change, my coworkers and my team will change, but certain things I can count on will not change. This will give us a strong sense of stability. So when we peel away this onion and when we cut this apple up in 9 million pieces, you know, we can have all kinds of fancy steps and all kinds of fancy methodologies. At the end of the day, when you take a magnifying glass to it all, it's really that people are at the heart of a successful change management effort. And as the Three Musketeers said, one for all and all for one. That's your ultimate goal. Everybody pulling in the same direction, not individual contributors pulling against everybody's efforts. So hopefully in these last 50 minutes I've made you more than dangerous in what you know about change management. Obviously there's a lot more to be learned and a lot of processes to understand, but I would wish you well in your journey moving forward. And we have time for some questions, and I'm always available to answer anything online, as well as our company Molten Group, who does this work around the world, last year in 50 countries. So let me turn it back to Sarah at this point, and I will answer any questions we have in the remaining 10 or 15 minutes. Sarah?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. Very insightful presentation today. We do have some time for Mark to answer some of your questions, so go ahead and use your chat window there. Send those in. While we wait for those to kind of get gathered, let me just give you some information here on how you can keep in touch with us. As Mark mentioned, he's available through several channels, including phone, email, social media, and then the Molten Group's website. So take a look at that. And HRDQ, you can keep in touch with us for registering with our very next webinar. And that's also available through social media channels there. And you will receive a special offer for joining us today through your email after our session. And you can shop at our store, and that is HRDQstore.com. So it looks like we do have questions coming in here. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. So our first question, Mark, is from Sam. And she asks, how can you help people change their behaviors to be more supportive of the change effort?
Excellent question. I think, you know, this is all about behavior. I think part of this is a sponsor's responsibility to understand the types of behaviors that need to change first and foremost, so you have somewhat of a going-in blueprint. If the behavior you want to change is that we're more time sensitive to how we talk to customers, or we need to be more team oriented or collaborative versus individual contributor, setting up what those critical behaviors are, and then putting into people's performance management system ways in which they are evaluated on how their behaviors are actually operating once the system begins. So it's somewhat of a two-legged stool. You have to have the sponsors clearly understanding what are the critical behavior elements we need to see change relative to the change journey. And number two, we want to make sure that the performance management evaluation system highlights those new behaviors to see actually which behaviors are being carried out. Now, hopefully the organization has taken the time and effort to teach people how to operate in that new environment, either experientially or through practice or mentoring or coaching or something. But at the end of the day, it's really how people are going to be evaluated in the use of new behaviors and how that's happening. Thank you.
And our next question here is from Nancy, and Nancy asks, who in an organization, who is really the best person to lead a change effort?
Well, as I mentioned, it's, a lot of times companies feel that it should be the most senior level person, and not to take away from a sense of sponsorship, but I think there's a criteria screen and the characteristics you're looking for, and as mentioned in the presentation, having local credibility, having global field responsibility, having walked a mile, and those who will be impacted by the change itself. So having the local respect and credibility, regardless of that person's rank, it could be an informal leader, is the best person to lead the change effort. I'm dealing currently with a company now that the change leader happens to be a woman, spent 7 years working on an oil field platform, which is a real rarity. I'm dealing with another company where the change leader came directly from the field and had never worked in a major transformation or a big program change transformation. But this individual has respect of field people, engineers and surveyors, who will have to be intimately involved in the change. So having a criteria, local credibility, local respect, high levels of transparency, so they're not shying away simply because, as I mentioned, I don't like you, that's why I won't support the change.
Mm-hmm. And I actually have a follow-up then question to that. Based on then those changes, do you see any difference in your experience on the implementation when it comes to different levels of an organization? Say it's just a team that's going through a change, or a whole project, enterprise, maybe even a global change. Are there any kind of differences that sort of highlight for you in your experience?
Yes, and that's a great question. Actually, there are. A lot of times, let's say if they're putting in an SAP engagement or some software, they may only want to do the change at the project level, and they would want the change built into each step, each of the steps in that technology implementation. It might be configuration, it might be conference room pilot testing, it might be the rollout. So in that regard, when it's more project-oriented, they would want the change intimately involved in each of these steps so they could regroup. When it's more a program orientation, more global in scope, like big bangs or going live one day, there's somewhat more fear, but at least people see what the target is, and quite a bit of more change preparation is required. On some of these phased efforts we've seen, what happens is that they don't work as well as we'd like because people are still managing the old systems, and we're requiring them to manage multiple initiatives, and they get confused over which is the right thing to do at the right time. So, if we're implementing change at the team level, project level, program level, global level, we're really talking about the scope, the pace, and the level of complexity. All of these 8 steps I just shared with you, it's not one size fits all. It's the most important thing is fit for purpose. To scale this accordion effect, if you will, if you think about this as an accordion, to fit the pace and the scope of the change and the complexity that's required. So you can bring it in, you can bring it out, you can make music, or you can make squeaky noises. Either way, there's some components, but the size and the complexity of the scope will drive its fit for purpose.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, for answering these questions live today and really sharing all of your valuable knowledge with us.
You're welcome, and thanks everyone for sharing a valuable part of your time this afternoon. And if I can help you in any way, please feel free to email or call me. And certainly HRDQ has been a great resource for me during my professional life. I would encourage you to buy their products, work with them. It's a great organization, and I thank them for the opportunity today to meet and work with you in this particular session. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. If we did not get a chance to answer your question, Mark will be responding to questions by email, so go ahead and still type those in if you have still some pressing questions. Go ahead and send those along to us. And we really do appreciate your time today. We hope you found today's session enjoyable.